than even Tony Blair managed in 1997, driven out of Parliament in just 3.5 us this afternoon. This is an extraordinary tale. The man who won the 2019 general election with a higher share of the vote than even Tony Blair managed in 1997, driven out of Parliament in just 3.5 years. Was this, I mean, how precisely do we get from that enormous victory to leaving the green benches? Has there ever been a fall from grace that quick?
Not necessarily that quick, but it was interesting you quote the president of Tony Blair, because of course, you know, Tony Blair was once a very strong electoral asset for his party. But then in the wake of the Iraq war, much of that reputation was heavily compromised. Yes, Labour managed to win in 2005, but only on 36% of the vote, and thanks to a split of the opposition forces between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats. In other words, the lesson from Tony Blair is a politician who perhaps once was electorally popular and an asset to his party is not necessarily guaranteed to retain that position. Now, in Boris Johnson's case, the problem is fairly simple. Now, Mr. Johnson has had a certain style which in many respects was advantageous to him. He was focused on outcome and he's not too concerned about how you get there. Now, in the case of, for example, the proroguing of Parliament in September 2019, which of course was ruled illegal by the High Court, that in the end did not do Mr. Johnson any damage because at least half the country believed in what he was doing, i.e. trying to ensure the implementation of Brexit. In contrast, when it came to Partygate, there wasn't ever a constituency of people out there who were saying, well, you know what, it's fine if I couldn't visit my aged mother with dementia in a care home, or I couldn't attend my wife's or husband's funeral, but it's fine for 10 Downing Street to have what is widely regarded as a much more liberal interpretation of the COVID rules than everybody else was thought that they were expected to follow. And then on top of that, and crucially, the evidence of the polling is that people just don't believe that Mr. Johnson was not aware, or certainly should have been aware, that in fact the rules were being broken. And therefore somebody, a brilliant politician, a brilliant campaigner, a brilliant way with words, in the end is undone by that way with words because it's used in a way that voters in the end find unconvincing. And politicians who are unconvincing, who come to regard as a liar, are no longer going to be particularly effective at persuading the public.
Boris Johnson's political career has been fascinating. Firstly, the darling of sort of the Tory Eurosceptics as the Telegraph's Brussels columnist. Then, remarkably, the standard bearer of liberal London, the sort of flag bearer of liberal metropolitan Toryism. And then after 2015-16, to sort of represent the red wall and perhaps a more socially conservative form of conservatism, at least amongst his voter base. This is a man who's had at least 3 different political lives. In his resignation letter, his essay, if you will, he hinted that he was leaving, quote, at least for now. Could he possibly have a 4th political life and potentially might there in the future be space for him to return to frontline politics?
Well, I'm tempted to say, Tom, that certainly some of Mr. Johnson's critics would quote exactly the record that you have just cited and suggest that perhaps this is somebody who's always been rather more concerned with the acquisition of office rather than necessarily what you do with it once you are there. But I'll leave that to others as to whether or not they think that conclusion is valid or not. I think the honest truth is, Tom, it's very, very difficult to see a way back for Boris Johnson. I just come back to my previous answer. This is somebody whose reputation with the wider public has been very heavily compromised, if not destroyed, by their perceptions of both what happened during the COVID pandemic and also about the way in which he then responded to allegations about what was going on in 10 Downing Street. You just remember that, again, polling done by YouGov over the weekend, nearly 2/3 of people think that he lied to the House of Commons, and that includes nearly 50% of those people who voted Conservative in 2019. Yes, there are still people out there who admire Mr. Johnson, who think he was the best Prime Minister we've had for a long time. But that is now very much a minority, and is probably now also a minority of those who actually voted for the Prime Minister back in December 2019.
Now we have almost no time left at all, but I do want to squeeze in one little more question for you, Sir John. The expectations that somehow Boris Johnson could return in another party, could there be an appetite for some sort of Farage-Johnson awkward coalition? I'm not sure quite how those two men could ever work together, but there's a lot of speculation about it. Do you see anything in it?
Well, I think certainly if I were to write the script for Mr. Sunak's worst nightmare, it would be indeed that Mr. Farage and Mr. Johnson were to get together and to fight the next general election seriously. I think that would probably kill off whatever small chances the Conservatives still have of winning the next general election. But of course, being able to bring an existing party down is not the same thing as necessarily providing a foundation for an alternative political force that would be capable of impelling Mr. Johnson back to 10 Downing Street. That strikes me as a very, very long road indeed. Just remember, Change UK not so long ago tried to split off from the left of British politics. An attempt to do that from the right is probably going to prove to be just as difficult.
Oh, Change UK. Heady days in 2019, was it? Yes. Sir John Curtice, thank you so much for talking us through the electoral implications there of an extraordinary weekend in British politics.